After installing the supercharger, we realized that the stock kickdown cable for the transmission couldn't quite reach the throttle linkage on the carburetor. On a Turbo 350 you can get away with driving it without this cable installed, so I had initially left it off to focus on the supercharger install. Additionally, the rubber transmission pan gasket I had used has been leaking, as well as the dipstick tube seal. So while the pan is off and the fluid is out, we'll try to take care of all of these problems. The first step is, with the car up on jack stands, to drop the transmission pan. Unfortunately, draining these transmissions is always a bit of a mess. Once most of the fluid is drained out, we can fully remove the transmission pan and pan gasket. And then we can remove the transmission filter. This one isn't particularly old, but while we're in here, we'll replace it anyway. So it's not great. This is definitely a high mileage transmission. All the black stuff in here is from the clutch discs in the transmission. Since this was after only like 5,000 miles, because that's the last time I took this out and changed the filter, this transmission might not have the longest life ahead of it. It's never really behaved badly, and it shifts well, so hopefully it lasts longer than this is making it look like it will. I've gone ahead and marked a spot to drill because we're going to be installing a drain plug. That way, anytime I have to drain the fluid in the future, it won't be such a mess and it'll be a lot faster and a lot easier. I'll be doing this the same way I did it for the 700R4 in the S10. Basically, I looked for some space with a bit of extra clearance, and we're going to drill a 1/2 inch hole right here and weld the 1/2 inch nut to the inside of the pan and use the bolt and an aluminum washer to seal against the outside of the pan. Having the nut on the inside of the pan means it won't drain out everything, but it saves a bit of extra clearance down here and it'll be easier to get it to seal. And now, since obviously this isn't the flattest pan in the world, we'll try to flatten that out a little bit. We'll use these big washers to try to flatten out the nearby metal. Okay, so after that we should have a fairly flat surface right around the bolt hole. So now I'll clean up the area around the hole with some non-chlorinated brake clean. And we'll clean up the nut as well. And then we'll go ahead and tighten the bolt on here. I gave the pan a test fit to make sure it clears, and we're in good shape. So we'll go ahead and weld the nut to the oil pan. And of course, we want to make sure we clean it up really well so that there's no weld slag getting into the transmission. With the inside cleaned up, I'm going to smooth out the surface just a little bit on the outside, and then we're pretty much done. So that should be a flat enough surface for our washer to seal against. I've been making sealing washers out of aluminum sheet for quite a while now, and it seems to do very well. They're exactly as simple as they look. All I'm doing is drilling a hole in the aluminum and cutting it out roughly in a washer shape. We'll install the bolt with the aluminum washer and torque it to 25 foot-pounds. Something nice about this arrangement is if it has a really slow leak, we can just tighten it a bit more, and with any luck, it'll go away. And I'll very quickly touch up the paint and paint over the bolt to try to keep things from rusting. I already removed the oil dipstick tube. Next, I unbolted the kickdown cable from the transmission housing so we can unhook it from the kickdown lever and remove it from the vehicle. To remove the kickdown cable from its linkage, all we need to do is remove this spring clip. So up top is the old kickdown cable, and down below is the new one. It's difficult to measure the old cable in the vehicle, so I just went with the longest cable I could find for a reasonable price. The new one looks like it's maybe 6 inches longer than the old one, so I think it'll be okay. The old one has this double O-ring seal, while the new one has this grommet type seal, but I don't think that'll be a problem. So we just transfer over the linkage rod piece. And once we clean things up a bit, we can install this into the transmission. Once it's in place, we'll tighten down the hold down bolt and reattach the linkage inside of the transmission. We'll make sure everything actuates correctly by pulling on the other side of the cable. Now, let's get the transmission put back together. I'll rinse off the transmission parts with some brake clean and clean up the sealing surfaces for the pan gasket. We'll install a new filter and filter seal, and with the paint on the pan dry, it's ready to be reinstalled. We'll hold the pan gasket on with a couple of bolts and lift everything up to the transmission. We'll make sure the gasket is exactly where it needs to be and install all of the pan bolts. We'll go over them slowly in several passes and tighten them down to 12 foot-pounds. Once everything is tight, including the kickdown cable and the dipstick tube, we can add fluid to the transmission, being careful not to overfill it. Not too long after that, we realized the dipstick tube was not sealing, so I had to remove it again and try to find the proper seal for the dipstick tube. Nobody local had one in stock, and I needed the car to be driving by the end of the night. So I ran to the local hardware store and found these, which appeared to be the exact same size. They're nitrile rubber and they should stand up to the oil just fine. And once the dipstick tube was reinstalled with these new O-rings, the leaks appear to have stopped. So the kickdown cable is all hooked up, but it's a little too short. As you can see here, should not be able to do that while it's connected. The problem is the distance from the end of here to the adjuster is farther on this one than it was on the old one. And the adjustable bracket is all the way at the end of its adjustment already. So we're going to make a little extension for it. The throttle and transmission cable bracket that is on the car is adjustable, but it simply doesn't adjust far enough. So I decided to go ahead and make this little steel bracket to extend that adjustability and allow the cable to be mounted farther back. This ensures the cable is as tight as it should be and allows for plenty of adjustment in the future. With this simple adjustment to the bracket, I was able to readjust the cable for wide open throttle and get the car back on the road by the end of the night. With a tiny bit of fine tuning, I got the cable dialed in, and now the transmission drops a gear and gets the engine screaming just like it should.